Most of the time when you construct a garment, there are going to be small sections somewhere that are going to require some hand stitching. That is my least favorite part of constructing, and so I want to ensure that if I am hand stitching something down, it is going to be secure enough that I won't need to redo it a year or so down the road because it's become loose. And so I wanted to share with you the stitch that I use to hand stitch down any areas. So obviously with a little bias band on a sleeve, you're going to hand stitch on the inside. And hopefully you can see that I have these little tiny stitches that are barely visible. That's one area that typically requires stitching. Another place where I have to hand stitch is yoke lining when it's being stitched to, down to the yoke to secure it. And again, you can see just little tiny stitches along the yoke here. So I don't really know what this stitch is called. I call it a locking stitch because each stitch does lock into place. I haven't found a name for this stitch in any of my textbooks, and I was not taught this in school. So if you are aware of a name, please comment below. I'd love to know what this is called. So I've put together here a sample of what would be a sleeve band, a bias sleeve band, and I'm using contrasting fabrics so that hopefully you will be able to see, because obviously if I did white on white, the stitches that you hope to be invisible would be invisible to the viewer. So to create this stitch, you want to you begin by sliding along the fold of the bias or the fold of the facing, whatever it is you're stitching. So the needle is inside the fold here, and I go forward maybe a generous 1/8 of an inch. The stripes, the white stripes here, are 1/8 of an inch. The red stripes are slightly smaller than 1/8 of an inch, just to give you a little perspective on stitch length. So you slide along the fold, you go into the stitching line of the sleeve where you attach the bias to the sleeve, and then just pick up a small bit of the fold of the bias band and pull that through. This is the part that locks it. What you want to do before you go forward with your needle is go just behind that stitch that you just took, and then again going through the fold of the fabric, you bring your needle forward, slightly larger than 1/8 of an inch, and that creates the lock of the stitch. So I've gone forward. Now I pick up my stitching line here. Trying to see this, okay, and then just a small bit of the fold of the fabric, pull that through, but then to lock it, you go behind the stitch the straight stitch you just made, and then bring the needle forward in the fold of the fabric again. So this is an incredibly secure stitch. Now obviously if you're doing this on a garment you're working on, you would use a thread weight that matches your fabric weight. I'm using an all-purpose thread here because I thought with it being a little bit heavier, being as it's a 40 weight thread, that it might be easier for you to see. Typically I would be using a 60 weight thread on most of my children's garment construction. So you can see after you've pulled that through, it's pretty snug, but once you go behind that stitch and then forward again, that locks that stitch in place. So if you ever have to remove it, you literally have to pick out every single stitch that you've made. You don't you don't want to have to pick this out for any reason. And again, like I said, I wasn't taught this in school. This is something handed down from my grandmother, and I'm sure she handed it down from her grandmother, but it's not a stitch I see in textbooks, and it's not something I learned in any of my classes. So it's the stitch with no name, but it's a great stitch, and everybody should have this stitch in their toolbox, because if you stitch your handwork down using this stitch, you're never going to have to, it's never going to be brought back to you to fix because these stitches came loose. So hopefully you can see this green where I've got this little tiny pick each step of the way along here on the bias band. So that is how I hand whip down anything that I need to secure. It stays in indefinitely, so you won't ever need to do it again. So I wanted to share that with you, and I hope you enjoy giving it a try. It does take a little bit longer, because if you were just doing one stitch along the way, obviously it would go quicker, but this is 2 stitches for each one of any other method. If you enjoyed this video and don't want to miss out on any others that are coming in the future, please hit the subscribe button.